General Hospital spoilers reveal that the web of deceit and manipulation surrounding Stella has become increasingly complex, and with each passing day, the stakes rise higher. Drew Kane, whose moral compass had always been shaky at best, now finds himself consumed by an obsessive drive that is slowly engulfing everything and everyone in his path. This new obsession has shifted his focus onto Stella Henry, once a respected social worker and a vital part of Curtis Ashford's life. What started as an act of retribution against Curtis has now grown into something far darker, more dangerous, and far-reaching. The stakes have gone beyond personal vendettas. This is now a game of power, control, and survival, and Drew is more than willing to destroy anyone who stands in his way. It all began with small manipulations, the kind of moves that Drew had mastered over the years, strategic, calculated, and precise. However, his relentless pursuit of control has turned into an all-consuming obsession. Drew isn't just fighting against Curtis anymore, he's now fighting against the very people who had once trusted him. And Stella, unfortunately, finds herself directly in his sights. Her past actions, once well-intentioned, are now the very leverage Drew plans to exploit to achieve his own ends. Stella's involvement in Martin's insurance fraud, something she did out of a sense of compassion, has now become the weapon Drew will use to weaken Curtis, and by extension, her own family. Drew's motivations are no longer rooted in reason or logic, they are driven by a deep-seated need for power and control, as well as a desire to keep Willow within his grasp. The more Drew learns about Stella's past, the more he sees an opportunity to manipulate her and bend her to his will. He is aware that her compassion, her willingness to break the rules for those she loves, could be her undoing. The problem for Stella is that Drew knows just how to exploit these traits, and he plans to do so with cold efficiency. For Drew, Stella has become a pawn in a much larger game, and he's willing to sacrifice her just as easily as he's done with others in the past. As Drew tightens his grip on Stella, she finds herself in a predicament unlike anything she's faced before. The world she once knew, where she used her position to help those in need, to make a real difference, is being dismantled by the very people she trusted. She's caught between her loyalty to Curtis and her desperate need to protect her own reputation and career. The social worker who once acted with kindness and compassion is now a target, her actions under a magnifying glass, her future uncertain. Stella may have once been willing to bend the rules for the sake of her patients, but she's now being forced to confront the consequences of those decisions in a way she never imagined. The tension between Drew and Stella grows increasingly palpable as he manipulates her into a corner. The truth of what Drew is doing to her begins to sink in slowly. She can feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the burden of guilt, fear, and uncertainty clouding her thoughts. The walls are closing in, and despite her strength, Stella begins to see no way out. She had hoped that her past actions, done out of a sense of duty and love for those around her, would go unnoticed. But now, they are the very reason she is being dragged into a web of corruption and blackmail. Drew's relentless pursuit is something Stella hasn't experienced before. While she's been in difficult situations in the past, this feels different, more personal, more dangerous. Drew has no qualms about exposing her darkest secrets if it means furthering his own agenda. And Stella knows that if Drew gets what he wants, her career, her reputation, and everything she has worked for will be destroyed. The manipulation begins slowly, with Drew planting seeds of doubt, making subtle threats, and using his knowledge of her past actions to force her hand. But as the days go on, his demands become more direct, more insistent. Stella is no longer in control of the situation, and she can feel herself slipping further into his grasp. But even as Drew tightens the noose around Stella's neck, he is also playing a dangerous game with Curtis. Curtis, who had once been one of his closest allies, is now a target in Drew's twisted vendetta. Drew knows that by targeting Stella, he will also weaken Curtis. Curtis's loyalty to his family and his career is something Drew plans to exploit. He is aware of Curtis's devotion to Stella, and by manipulating the situation, Drew can isolate him and make him more vulnerable. The psychological toll on Curtis becomes clear, as he struggles to balance his loyalty to his family with the growing realization that Drew is no longer the man he once trusted. As Drew's manipulation intensifies, Stella is forced into a difficult position. She could expose Drew for what he is, risking her own safety and reputation in the process, or she could continue to play along with his demands, hoping that she can find a way out of this nightmare. She doesn't know which option is worse, but she knows that neither path will lead to an easy resolution. Drew's obsession with control is pushing her to her limits, and the emotional cost is beginning to show. She is torn between the need to protect her family and her desire to end the blackmail once and for all. The stakes are growing higher with every move Drew makes. The truth about what he is doing to Stella could destroy him, but Drew is willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to get what he wants. His obsession with control has become all-consuming. And no one, not even those he loves, will be spared from the fallout. He is no longer just a man seeking power, he is a man lost in his own web of manipulation, unable to see the damage he is causing to everyone around him. Stella, once a symbol of strength and compassion, is now trapped in a vicious cycle of fear and desperation. Drew's obsession with her and Curtis is driving her to the edge, and she knows that if she doesn't act soon, it could all come crashing down. The lines between right and wrong are becoming increasingly blurred, and Stella is forced to question whether she can maintain her integrity in the face of Drew's manipulations. But one thing is certain, the stakes have never been higher, and the fallout from Drew's obsession is about to reach new heights. The game is no longer just about revenge, it's about survival. Stella's world, once built on trust and dedication to her work as a social worker, is now crumbling under the weight of a dangerous secret. The threat of insurance fraud. Something she had once thought was buried in her past, has surfaced in the most devastating way possible. Her connection to Martin's insurance scheme, though done with good intentions, is now a double-edged sword that could destroy everything she's worked for. And looming over her is none other than Drew Kane, whose new role as a powerful senator places him in a position where he can turn her life upside down with a single move. Drew's motivations, once driven by personal ambition, have now taken on an even darker tone. His role in government gives him the power and leverage to destroy those who stand in his way, and Stella has become his latest target. Drew's growing obsession with control, particularly with Curtis's family, has reached a new level, and he knows that the insurance fraud could be the perfect weapon to bring Stella to her knees. By leveraging this information, Drew has the ability to not just expose Stella but to have her arrested, thrown into prison, and her career ruined beyond repair. Drew's power as a senator gives him an almost unchecked ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. He knows that the law is not just a tool of justice, it's a weapon. And for someone like Stella, who has spent years building a reputation as a dedicated and compassionate social worker, this threat is far more than just a legal issue, it's a direct attack on her character, her life, and everything she has built. Drew, consumed by his desire to control the situation, sees Stella's involvement in the insurance fraud as the perfect way to achieve his goal of revenge against Curtis and to demonstrate his power over everyone who has crossed him. As the investigation into Stella's actions intensifies, Drew becomes more and more fixated on using this against her. The fact that he can pull strings, use his political power to push for Stella's prosecution, gives him an eerie sense of satisfaction. It's not just about the crime itself, it's about control. He knows that by using Stella, he can break Curtis's resolve and strike at the heart of a family he's always resented. Drew's obsession has evolved from a need for power into something far darker, a desire to destroy those who have caused him pain, no matter the cost. For Stella, the situation is unbearable. She is trapped, caught between the guilt of her past actions and the very real threat of losing everything. The system she once worked within, the very principles she had sworn to uphold, are now being used against her. The thought that Drew could have her imprisoned for a mistake she made out of compassion makes her feel helpless and vulnerable. She knows that Drew is playing a dangerous game, but she also knows that he won't stop until he has achieved his goal. Her fate lies in his hands. And the realization that someone she trusted could be the one to ruin her is a bitter pill to swallow. As Drew continues to tighten the noose around Stella, the emotional toll on her grows heavier. The very foundation of her life is being shaken, and the person behind it all is someone she thought she could rely on. Drew's manipulation, his cold, calculated obsession with control, has made him a formidable adversary, and Stella is finding it nearly impossible to escape his grasp. She knows that she's running out of time. That every move she makes could be the one that pushes her closer to ruin. The fear of going to prison, of losing everything she has worked for, haunts her every step. But it's not just the legal consequences that weigh on Stella, it's the emotional and psychological toll that Drew's actions are taking on her. His obsession is poisoning everything around her, turning her relationships with the people she loves into battlegrounds. As Drew continues to play his game, he isolates Stella further, driving a wedge between her and the people who care about her. The emotional toll of being in Drew's crosshairs is pushing her to her limits, and she knows that the longer this goes on, the more she risks losing herself in the process. In the end, Drew's manipulation and control over Stella's fate become a symbol of his growing obsession with power and revenge. He no longer sees her as a person, she is merely a pawn in his larger game. The stakes have never been higher, and as the pressure mounts, the path forward seems more uncertain than ever. Stella's future is now in Drew's hands. And she knows that unless she can find a way to turn the tables, she could lose everything. The battle for control is now at its peak, and the question remains. Will Drew's obsession with destroying Stella, and Curtis, be his undoing, or will he succeed in crushing them all beneath the weight of his political power? Curtis sat in silence, the weight of the news pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The moment the words had left Drew's mouth, everything he thought he knew about his family had been thrown into chaos. Stella, his beloved aunt, the woman who had always been his protector and guide, was now in grave danger. The knowledge that she was being targeted, that Drew was using her to get back at him and dismantle everything he held dear, left him reeling. His world, already fractured by betrayal and loss, now felt like it was shattering into pieces. The realization hit Curtis like a freight train, and the emotional toll was immediate and devastating. The thought that someone he had once trusted, could use Stella as a pawn in their twisted game of revenge made his blood run cold. Drew had crossed a line, and it wasn't just personal anymore. This was no longer about family business or some petty grudge. Drew's actions were putting Stella in harm's way, and Curtis couldn't sit idly by and let that happen. The man who had once been his ally, his friend, was now his greatest enemy. Curtis had always been someone who valued loyalty above all else, but Drew had turned that very loyalty into a weapon. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything Curtis had ever experienced. To know that Drew had been manipulating his aunt, using her to further his own ambitions, filled him with a burning need for retribution. He couldn't let this slide. Drew had gone too far, and Curtis was prepared to take drastic action. He had always prided himself on staying calm under pressure, but the idea of losing Stella, or worse, seeing her destroyed by Drew's machinations, had pushed him to the edge. The pain of betrayal was one thing, but the pain of seeing someone he loved so deeply used as a pawn was something entirely different. Curtis wasn't sure how to process the emotions that surged within him. Anger, fear, guilt, and betrayal all collided in a storm that threatened to overwhelm him. The desire for revenge began to burn brightly, and Curtis knew there was no turning back. Drew had set in motion a series of events that would change everything. And Curtis was determined to make him pay for what he had done. As the reality of the situation settled in, Curtis's mind began to work overtime. His thoughts raced, calculating his next move. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to be strategic, precise. Drew had already shown how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted, and Curtis knew that if he didn't act fast, Stella's life could be ruined. But revenge wasn't just about striking back in the heat of the moment. It was about finding the right leverage, the right way to dismantle Drew's control, and making him feel the weight of his actions. Curtis understood that, in order to defeat Drew, he would have to play a dangerous game of his own. But the stakes were higher than ever before. The shock of learning that Stella was in danger had set off a chain reaction in Curtis. He was no longer just the businessman, the loyal nephew, or the husband trying to hold everything together. He was a man consumed by rage, someone who was willing to do whatever it took to protect his family. The idea of taking revenge on Drew, of righting the wrongs that had been done to Stella, became Curtis's singular focus. He knew that this was his moment, the one chance to reclaim everything that had been taken from him. But with each passing day, as he plotted his next move, the cost of his revenge began to weigh on him. The more Curtis thought about the situation, the more he realized that his actions would have consequences far beyond his immediate family. The fallout from Drew's betrayal would affect everyone around them, the people they both cared about, the businesses they had built, the relationships they had forged. Revenge, Curtis knew, would come at a price. But in that moment, as he grappled with the enormity of what he was about to do, he felt like he had no choice. The man who had once been his brother-in-arms had now become his greatest adversary, and Curtis wasn't about to let him destroy everything he loved without a fight. But as the plan for retaliation began to take shape, Curtis felt a gnawing doubt at the back of his mind. Was he making the right choice? Was revenge the answer? Or was he only digging himself deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of? The lines between right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, became increasingly blurred. The more he tried to focus on the task at hand, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He knew that this would change everything, his relationship with Drew, his relationship with Stella, and even his own sense of self. Revenge, Curtis realized, had a way of consuming everything in its path. And it was only a matter of time before he lost control of it entirely. Despite the uncertainty, Curtis pressed on. The thought of Stella suffering at Drew's hands was too much for him to bear. He couldn't sit by and let Drew destroy the woman who had always been there for him, who had shown him nothing but love and support. As much as revenge tempted him, it was the need to protect Stella that drove him forward. He would stop at nothing to bring Drew to justice, to make him feel the full weight of his betrayal. As Curtis's plans took shape, the tension between him and Drew grew. The war between them was no longer just about family business, it was about survival. Curtis wasn't just fighting for his aunt. He was fighting for his own redemption, his own sense of justice. The lines between right and wrong were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate, but Curtis knew one thing for sure. Drew had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And as the confrontation neared, Curtis was ready to make Drew pay for the suffering he had caused. The path to vengeance was a dark and dangerous one, but Curtis was willing to walk it, no matter the cost. The shock of learning that Stella was in danger had ignited something in Curtis that could never be extinguished. It had unleashed a fury that would not be silenced until Drew was brought to justice. But as the stakes grew higher, and the repercussions of his actions became clearer, Curtis couldn't help but wonder, was the revenge worth the cost, or would it consume him in the end? The answer would come soon enough, but for now, all Curtis could focus on was the one thing that mattered, making Drew pay for what he had done. Curtis had never been one to back down from a challenge, but the situation he now found himself in was one that demanded a level of ruthlessness he had rarely shown. His anger, fueled by the betrayal he had suffered at the hands of Drew, was now turning into something far more calculated and dangerous. Drew's actions had crossed a line. And Curtis knew that the only way to truly bring him down was to play the game on his terms, by using Drew's own weaknesses against him. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about stripping Drew of everything he had used to manipulate and control those around him. Curtis had come to realize that Drew's obsession with power, with control over others, had been his greatest vulnerability all along. And Curtis, as someone who had been on the receiving end of Drew's scheming, knew exactly how to turn that obsession against him. The key to Drew's undoing lay in the one thing Drew held closest, his relationships with those around him, particularly Willow and Nina. Curtis saw an opportunity to exploit these connections, to use them as leverage in his plan to take Drew down. If Drew was willing to destroy families, manipulate people for his own gain, then Curtis had no qualms about using his own family to expose him. Willow and Nina were Curtis's pawns in this new game. He knew that Willow, still reeling from Drew's betrayal, would be an unwilling ally in his pursuit of justice. Nina, on the other hand, was an open book, Curtis understood her vulnerabilities, the deep-seated guilt she carried over her past actions. And he knew that he could use that against her. The key was to make them both realize that the only way to truly defeat Drew was to expose everything, the manipulation, the lies. The schemes that had been hiding in plain sight. As Curtis made his moves, his strategy became clear. He would reveal Drew's darkest secrets. The ones that even Drew himself had hoped would remain buried. His past with Nina, the affair that had torn Willow's world apart, was the linchpin. Curtis knew that if he could force Drew into a corner, if he could make Willow and Nina see the truth about Drew's betrayal, they would turn against him. The truth was more powerful than any manipulation Drew could conjure, and Curtis was prepared to use it to his advantage. In his mind, the plan was simple. He would slowly start pulling at the threads that bound Drew's relationships with Willow and Nina, exposing his darkest secrets one by one. Once those truths were out in the open, Drew's carefully crafted facade would crumble. His power would vanish, and with it, the control he had so ruthlessly exerted over those closest to him. And Curtis, who had long felt the sting of Drew's manipulation, would finally have his revenge. Curtis didn't just want to destroy Drew. He wanted to strip him of everything, his relationships, his power, and his freedom. The idea of seeing Drew behind bars was a sweet thought, one that Curtis couldn't shake as he moved forward with his plan. He knew it would be difficult, that the fallout would affect everyone involved, but he was willing to pay that price. The damage Drew had caused to his family, to Willow, and to Nina, was too much to ignore. Curtis had no intention of letting Drew walk away from the chaos he had caused. The moment Curtis decided to take this course of action, he knew there was no turning back. He was already in too deep. And as the weeks went by, the walls began to close in on Drew. The more Curtis dug, the more he uncovered evidence of Drew's lies, his manipulations, and his ability to destroy lives for his own gain. Drew's every move, every calculated decision, was now being used against him, and Curtis was slowly tightening the noose. He knew that Drew, for all his smarts and cunning, had underestimated the one thing Curtis had in spades, determination. And as Drew's world began to unravel, the shockwaves rippled outward. Drew's arrest was no longer a question of if but when. Curtis had taken the first steps toward taking Drew down, and every step drew him closer to his ultimate goal, justice, not just for himself, but for everyone Drew had hurt along the way. The story of Drew's downfall was no longer a hypothetical. Curtis had made it his mission to make sure Drew faced the consequences of his actions. The revelations about Drew's past, particularly his affair with Nina and the lies that had damaged Willow's life, were just the beginning. As Curtis maneuvered through his plan, he knew that the final blow would come when Drew's own actions caught up with him. The truth about his manipulations would be exposed, and with it, Drew's grip on those around him would slip away, leaving him vulnerable to the justice Curtis had long been seeking. Curtis had no intention of letting Drew go free, and every step he took toward exposing Drew's lies only solidified his resolve. Drew had made his enemies. Now, Curtis was making sure that Drew would pay for his sins. The shockwaves were already reverberating through Port Charles, and Drew's fall from grace was fast approaching. Curtis was ready for it, and soon, so would everyone else. The truth had a way of coming out, and Drew's time was running out.